The storm hit just minutes after the old woman finished her evening prayers, and the first roar of the wind sounded like the sky itself was breaking open. Snow slammed against her tiny wooden house so hard that the windows shook like they were about to burst. But what really made her heart jump wasn't the storm. It was the sound of 9 roaring engines cutting through the darkness, stopping right outside her front porch as if the storm had dragged them there on purpose. For a moment, she froze, wondering why a pack of bikers would show up at her door in the middle of the worst blizzard the county had seen in 20 years. Then she saw the shadows moving through the whiteout, and something inside her whispered that fate had just arrived. She wasn't a woman who scared easily. She was 74, small in size, but strong in spirit. Her neighbors always said she had a soul louder than thunder and a heart warmer than a summer morning. Still, even she couldn't ignore the fear that slipped into her chest when she saw 9 huge men, covered in snow, leather jackets stiff with ice, trudging toward her tiny home like they were survivors of a shipwreck. They looked like giants who had been carved out of the mountains, big beards, cold hands, faces hardened by life on the road. The jackets carried the same emblem, a winged skull with flames behind it. Above it, bold letters spelled out one name they carried with pride, Hell's Angels. But the moment she saw them stumble, exhausted, shivering, the skin turning pale from the cold, every fear melted away. They weren't monsters. They were men who were freezing to death. She threw her door open and stepped outside into the screaming wind, letting the snow whip her face. She waved her hands wildly, telling them to come in. They hesitated, confused, maybe even embarrassed to accept help from a small old woman. But when another blast of wind nearly knocked one of them to the ground, she didn't wait for permission. She marched right up to the biggest one, grabbed his wrist, and tugged him toward the house like she was dragging her own grandson inside. Once they stepped across her porch, the warmth of her home wrapped around them like a blanket. The house was tiny, just 2 rooms and a kitchen, but the heat from the wood stove felt like heaven after the storm. The men stood quietly, almost awkwardly, dripping snow everywhere, filling the room with the smell of leather, gasoline, and winter. She didn't ask who they were, where they were going, or why they were out riding in a blizzard. She just pointed to the stove and told them to warm up. There was no dialogue, only movements, like watching a silent movie. The men removed the gloves with stiff fingers, rubbing their hands together. Steam rose from their jackets as the heat slowly thawed them. The old woman moved around the kitchen with purpose, pulling out pots, water, spices, and ingredients from a pantry that barely had enough to feed her alone. But she cooked as if she had enough for an army, stirring and tasting, adding more broth, more vegetables, stretching the little she had into something filling. When she placed the steaming pot of soup in the center of the room, the men stared at it like it was the first real food they had seen in days. She ladled out bowl after bowl, their large hands trembling from exhaustion as they accepted the warm meal. One of them looked at her as if trying to understand why a stranger would do all this for them. She simply tapped her chest and then pointed at him, her way of saying, "A heart helps who it wants to help." As they ate, color slowly returned to their cheeks. Their eyes softened. Some leaned back against the wall, letting themselves breathe again. They might have been tough bikers, but, in that moment, they looked like tired sons finding a safe place for the night. The storm outside howled on, but inside her home, everything felt quiet and protected, like the walls were blessed. When the storm became too violent to leave, they settled on the floor, wrapped in blankets she pulled out from old trunks. She placed extra logs in the stove, even though she knew she might run low by morning. She didn't care. Warmth was meant to be shared. Before sleeping, she took one last look at the 9 strangers stretched across her floor, and something about the sight filled her with a strange peace. She felt like she had done exactly what she was meant to do. By morning, the storm finally softened, but the world outside was buried under mountains of snow. The men stepped out onto her porch, looking at the long road ahead. They tried to give her money. She pushed their hands away. They tried to leave supplies. She shook her head. She didn't help people for rewards. She did it because she had lived long enough to know that kindness always finds its way back, even when you least expect it. But as they stood there, all 9 of them, staring at the small woman who had saved them, something changed in their eyes. They weren't just grateful, they were moved, they were loyal, they were connected to her now in a way that didn't need words. Before leaving, they did something she didn't understand at first. They placed a patch on her porch railing. The same emblem from their jackets. A winged skull with flames. But this one had something extra stitched at the bottom, protected for life. She didn't know exactly what it meant, but she felt the weight of it, like a promise carved into stone. Weeks passed, then months. She returned to her quiet life, baking bread, tending her small garden, praying by her window each morning. She never expected to see the bikers again. She thought it had just been one strange night that would fade into memory. But life had other plans. One evening, as the sun was sinking and the sky turned purple, a truck driver lost control on the icy road near her house. The vehicle crashed into her fence, sending splintered wood flying everywhere. The sound was so loud that it echoed through the whole valley. The man stumbled out of the truck, angry and drunk. When the old woman stepped outside to check on him, he started shouting at her, blaming her for standing too close, blaming the road, blaming everything except himself. He grabbed her arm, hard. The fear she thought she had left behind came rushing back. She tried to pull away, but his grip tightened. Her heart pounded. For the first time in years, she felt truly vulnerable. She wished someone, anyone, was there to help. Then the sound came. Not one engine, not 2, but 9. 9 roaring motorcycle engines shaking the ground like thunder rolling across the earth. The drunk man froze. His eyes widened. The old woman turned slowly, and there they were, 9 bikers riding toward her house in a perfect line, dust and cold mist swirling around them like they had risen straight out of the mountains. Their headlights cut through the dusk. Their tires crunched on the gravel. They looked like guardians sent by fate itself. When they reached her yard, the men stepped off the bikes with a silent authority that made the drunk man's legs tremble. He let go of her arm instantly. No one touched her again. The bikers didn't need to speak. Their presence alone was enough to send the man running back to his truck, fumbling, tripping, desperate to escape. When he sped away, the 9 bikers turned to the old woman. She stood there with tears in her eyes, not because she was scared but because she realized something powerful. Those men hadn't just been passing through that night. They had been watching over her, keeping track, checking in from time to time without her noticing. She didn't know how often they drove past her road, or how long they waited nearby, but she understood now that their promise had been real. Protected for life. They didn't stay long. They didn't need thanks. They simply looked at her one last time, nodded gently, and rode off into the fading light. Their engines echoed through the valley until the sound disappeared entirely. Years passed after that day. She grew older, her hair turned silver, her steps became slower, but she never felt alone again. Whenever a stranger came too close, or whenever trouble hovered near her quiet home, she would hear the rumble of engines in the distance, sometimes faint, sometimes near, just enough to remind her that 9 shadows on motorcycles were always keeping watch.